Hello and welcome everyone to this this session on cross-border data governance. My name is Christopher Decker. I'm a fellow at the Oxford Global Society and also a research fellow at the University of Oxford. My areas of interest are political economy, competition economics and regulation, and I'm particularly interested in how different governance frameworks and regulations are developed in different parts of the world. By way of background, this session is being convened by the Oxford Global Society, which is a UK-based independent non-political think tank that focuses on selected contemporary issues of global interest and its importance. Its mission is to conduct independent research, to provide independent advice, to engage with the global community, to inform the public on issues of global governance, and to provide a forum for debate and discussion. And this session is very much in line with those ambitions and aims. And I'm very pleased to be chairing this session today on the cross-border data flows. I should at the outset give thanks to Professor Yi-Chan Chin, another member of the Oxford Global Society who conceived of this idea and did much of the organisation. So thank you, Yi, for that.
Thank you.
Before we launch into it, it might be useful to have a few introductory remarks about to sort of frame the discussion and the things we want to talk about over the next hour and a half. And I think if you step back from the discussion, the background to the session is one where there's really an increasing awareness of the fact that data is constantly being collected by a range of entities in a range of different ways. And that this data has enormous value and potential, not only commercially, but also for society and for development. But for that potential to be realized, we need entities to be willing to share the data and countries to be willing to share data and accept data that they have amassed with other parties. It's also in a context, this discussion also happens in a context where there's concern about concentration of data by particular entities, private entities, but also in countries, which can give them tremendous power. And for some, this reflects a sort of missed opportunity. There's an opportunity cost, if you like, of not allowing others to access data who can do new and innovative things with it and could provide wider social benefits. So at the global level, we're seeing increasing recognition that data sharing across borders can provide social benefits and can promote development. However, while there's considerable potential, and many recognize this considerable potential from greater cross-border data sharing, it's currently limited by various factors, and hopefully we'll cover those today. But in general terms, these include things like concerns about privacy and data protection, what happens if data falls into the wrong hands or is misused, even anonymized data, which can be de-identified. National security concerns in some countries, concerns about giving data to giant companies in other countries, tech giants in other countries, or being compelled to give data to governments. Some countries are worried about hold-up, traditional ideas of if they give their data off to an entity in another country, will they be beholden to the entity and to that country in some way? And data sharing is also being limited by private concerns about losing competitive advantage for particular firms, which leads to sort of data hoarding, or at the country level, by countries being concerned about losing their comparative advantage. Many countries, many jurisdictions want to be world leaders in digital markets, and this is part of that. But finally, global data sharing is being, I think, impeded by the absence of an international agreement, rules, or some sort of multilateral governance framework. And it's this particular point that we want to discuss and focus on today. And as you can see, we've assembled an outstanding global panel of experts and speakers from all around the world, really, from India, China, the US, and Europe to assist us with our discussion. And what we've asked them to do is really to focus on 5 points. They may touch them, may not touch them, but these are common points that we've asked the speakers to address. And the first point is, what are the considerations that are shaping the rules for cross-border data sharing in their country or region? The second question is, what are the areas of difference between those rules in their country and elsewhere? A third question we've asked is to get their views on the feasibility of whether they think it's possible to develop an international approach to cross-border data sharing. What needs to happen to have some sort of rules or convergence or to develop a common approach? What sort of institutional arrangements need to be created to allow us to implement and monitor such an approach? And finally, what are the risks of not developing a sort of common international approach to data sharing? Could it lead to a digital divide? So these are the questions that we've asked our speakers to address today. So briefly, just to introduce the four speakers before we kick off the session, our first speaker is going to be Professor Susan Ariel Aaronson, who is a research professor and the director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at the George Washington University. The hub maps the governance of personal, public and proprietary data around the world and examines how it affects data-driven tech, human autonomy and human rights. So welcome, Professor Aaronson. Professor Mira Burri will be speaking next, and she is a professor of international economic and internet law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Lucerne in Switzerland, where she teaches international intellectual property law, media, internet and trade law. Mira is the principal investigator of the project Trade Law 4.0 under a European research grant, and she also consults with the European Parliament, UNESCO and others on the issues of digital innovation. Following Professor Burri will be Professor Yikchan Chin, who is an associate professor at the School of Journalism and Communication at Beijing Normal University. She teaches cyberspace governance, digital media law and ethics, and she participates in the UN's open-ended working group on developments in the field of information and telecommunications. And our final speaker will be Dr. Mansi Kedia, who is a senior fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Her areas of research include digital and telecommunications policy, tax, and industrial policy. And she was appointed a member of the task force for rewriting the direct tax code in India and is currently a mid-career fellow of the Internet Society. So we've asked each speaker to present for about 12 to 15 minutes, and after the presentations, we're hoping to have a discussion for around 20 to 30 minutes, in which time you'll be able to answer questions. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box as you listen to the speakers. So with all that said, I now pass over to Professor Aaronson to give her presentation. Thank you. Professor Aaronson, you're on mute, I think. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. So I've only done this 3 million times in the past 3 years, right? You'd think I know how to do it. Well, thank you so much. I won't take that long, but I want to just reiterate how honored I am to share this presentation and discussion with you, the audience, and these distinguished speakers. So what I'd like to do today is talk a bit. I'm just going to begin by saying that the United States is a mess. And our digital trade template is outdated and going nowhere. And the reason for that is there's no demand for it, right? It's just not a priority. Why? Because the United States is sort of captured by, I'm going to call them nationalists because I think people misuse the word populists. And as a result, the Biden administration very much wants to show that it's rethinking trade policy to address the needs of workers who have been affected by it. It's very much colored by national security concerns and fears about one particular country's authoritarianism and competitiveness in data-driven sectors. So Congress has not demanded it. There is no fast-track trade promotion authority. So the United States is trying to cooperate with other countries through the Trade and Technology Council, as example. Okay, but there is no supply. And another thing that might explain this is that the United States is to some extent captured by its data giants. So there aren't really original ideas. Meanwhile, there is what Jagdish Bhagwati called the spaghetti bowl or the noodle bowl. And I think this perception is really more about the fact that many countries don't understand data And there's very little attempt at collaborative approaches, as Mira's database and my own show. Yes, there is the free flow of data with exceptions. So, but beyond that, there's some significant differences. And so let's talk about data. And just, it really isn't the same thing as other things, goods and services that are traded across borders, right? Because data is really easy and cheap and to move, right? It's easy to share and reuse, but it is increasingly hoarded by governments and firms. Data can also be simultaneously a commercial asset and a public good, right? But no trade agreement mentions that dual nature. It's essential to national security and economic growth, and it's the foundation of a wide range of services, yet nobody really knows how to govern it. And that's what the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub tries to look at. We don't know what right looks like, but we do know that there are many different approaches. And what can we learn from those approaches? Okay, going more into detail, into most digital trade agreements, I'm not going to focus on what they do. I'm going to focus on what they don't do. Hope that's okay. So they don't really discuss the very issues that undermine trust. In 1997, the Clinton administration basically said, we're going to need to have some common ground to have the free flow of data. And they said, if we're going to do that, trust is essential. Yet they don't look at the very issues that people say when they're surveyed, if you believe in surveys, undermine trust, right? And what are those things? Well, when India shuts off the internet, or malware, or cross-border disinformation, or online harassment, some of those things don't really belong in trade agreements, but others could. They could be provisions, and those could address trust. Trade agreements also don't discuss data as both a commercial asset and a public good. And as Christopher said, the importance of sharing. They don't address the need for data governance capacity building, which is why so many countries, they don't, just as they pay rents on intellectual property, they're pretty angry if they don't have data-driven services that they'll have to import those in order to export commodities. And so we should be helping these countries develop the capacity to govern data. They don't address information asymmetries. That's another aspect of that point. I'm going to go into that a little bit more, and how that can hamper competition and innovation, right? The data-driven economy is very much dominated by firms in two countries. They don't really anticipate what new data-driven technologies may need. And I just cite virtual reality, extended reality, mixed reality, augmented reality as an example, which is going to require new ways of thinking about jurisdiction and property rights. And then they don't address new types of barriers. And I'm going to talk about that too in a second. So thanks for your patience. So regarding information asymmetries, are there data cartels? So here's what I'm talking about. Obviously, firms that have more computing power, and who are those firms? They're WeChat and Google and Meta. Those firms have more computing power, and they're better positioned to extract and use data. And those firms, in turn, are better positioned to exploit big data sets. Oh my God, I misspelled sets. They have more data, they hoard it, so they can create more goods and services. And this phenomenon also applies across country, right? UNCTAD has reported that there are 70 large data platforms, and they tend to be concentrated in middle income and wealthy countries, and in particular, 2 countries. And we all know which countries those are, US and China. So are these essentially data cartels? Something to think about. Okay, it also doesn't address future barriers. So what am I talking about here? All right. So one potential barrier could be data sharing rules. Why is that a potential barrier? Well, current EU law could be seen, I'm not saying it is, as violating most favored nation or national treatment. I want to give you another one. Apple has a privacy label, which means that it's very opaque about firms that it thinks don't deserve to be in its store, and it labels them. I'm not an Apple person, so I've actually not experienced this, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about it, but it's just like a social label, right? It could violate MFN and like product. Another one, censorship, right? When you turn off the internet or when you censor a firm, you are violating market access. And in turn, it can affect internet stability. So that could be a future trade barrier. So I just wanted to give some examples to get you thinking. This table has some more, and I can, share it again later. Okay, and then finally, it doesn't meet the challenges of new technologies. Now, an unwritten law of trade agreements is that they should be technologically neutral. But I also think they should be anticipatory and thoughtful. Well, let me give you an example. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. So the global market for AI is huge and growing. And AI, the holy grail is to make it a general purpose technology, right? So most people are very unaware that they use AI every day in everything from spell check to their schoolwork to how they find their future mates. And 2 countries dominate the AI market, and AI funding and AI research. And we know what those 2 countries are. My own country is losing some comparative advantage in that area, while countries such as Canada are gaining. But basically still, though, the largest firms dominate. And it's very interesting. These firms often rely on open source methods for their algorithms, but generally use trade secrets to protect their data and their algorithms, and most importantly, to control the data that they analyzed. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. And in my mind, that dominance leads to a perception that AI markets are unfair. And around the world, we see governments subsidizing the development of AI and starting to put in place what I would call AI protectionism. So let me give you an example of that. It may make it harder to set standards for ethical or trustworthy AI, which is the big fashion now. And trustworthy AI essentially means that you abide by a set of standards in designing, developing, deploying AI. And that, again, could be a form of social labeling, okay, which could lead, be perceived as a barrier, even though it has a noble purpose. Another thing that current rules don't address is that they don't advance data sharing among societal entities. And to me, that is a public good, a global public good, because such data sharing could solve wicked problems that cross borders and transcend generations. I condemn them because they do not incentivize shared approaches. They have all sorts of groovy language, like, I always find this language very odd. Government should endeavor to cooperate, but that doesn't mean they should cooperate. And if they did cooperate, that might have real important effects internationally. There's no encouraging of data sharing between governments and, the private sector and governments. It's all a one-way street. From, governments are supposed to put their data in machine-readable format, but there aren't the similar rules for the private sector to share data with others. So it's kind of weird. And I just think we need to think, is this template the best template? Is this the best that we can do? It may be the best that we can agree at. So this is the research that we do. It's called the Global Data Governance Mapping Project, and it maps what governments are doing for everything from, we start with strategies, we move to laws and regulations, then we go to governance structures, but we also look at the foundations of trust in governance. So, for example, does the public participate in the development of these policies? That's our latest research. And so check it out. Do you like my marketing skills? And thank you so much for hearing me out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Aaronson. That was very, very interesting to get a sense of what's happening, well, what's not happening in the US and your reflections on the challenges. We're going to go now to Lucerne, and Professor Burri will now give a presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm delighted to join you in this conversation today. So my goal would be to talk about the position of the European Union in this landscape of free trade agreements, in particular regulating data flows and privacy protection. And as Chris mentioned in the beginning, in order to somehow understand this, the backdrop is quite important, and there is a technological, geopolitical, and regulatory context that I'll briefly talk about in order to see how the EU's position has also evolved over time. So as Chris also mentioned, of course, the starting point of all these discussions is sort of the centrality of data for contemporary economies, but indeed also for contemporary societies as a whole. And although, of course, this what the economist said is somewhat a flawed statement because data is not necessarily exhaustible and its value may be lost over time, this is still an important statement to show that in the discussions of the regulation of electronic commerce, as we used to know it, we have now moved towards the regulation of the data-driven economy. So the scope actually of this regulation has increased over time, and governments have, of course, struggled to formulate new types of trade policies that can reflect these new practices that we have, including, of course, taking into account the growing importance of data. Why isn't it so easy to regulate data through trade agreements? On the one hand, it was pointed out, data must cross borders in order to have a living data-driven economy, in order to have digital innovation and growth. On the other hand, there are certain challenges, of course, that come with this. On the one hand, it is just not very easy when data leaves the country to a certain jurisdiction, and also to make sure that the interests, the values, and the rights of the citizenry in that country are properly protected. For the European Union, this has been, of course, the major preoccupation has been with the protection of privacy. But there are also, of course, other issues. And if you want to look at this rise of digital protectionism, there is a very interesting new report on unilateral measures that essentially lead to digital fragmentation. And you see here the link down on the slide. What is perhaps important to mention with regard particularly to privacy protection is that this data, this new data economy and big data analytics in particular, they have indeed put certain challenges before privacy regulation. And I have listed some of those. Chris mentioned some of those, that we don't have this distinction between personal and non-personal data. Re-identification is easy, and a lot of the sort of old-fashioned data protection laws that we have had around the world, including in the European Union, was simply not working properly in this new environment. And I'm going to come back to this later on, if you wish. Now, as was mentioned before also by Susan, we have a very dynamic landscape for the regulation of data flows and now also data protection in free trade agreements, in preferential trade agreements. And we have a great number of such agreements, and essentially all the recent agreements that we have dedicated rules on digital trade, including rules on data flows and privacy protection. Still, the number of agreements, if you compare the ratio of those agreements having rules on data flows and the rest of the FTAs, is not huge. It's not a huge number of treaties. What is particularly important, and maybe I would disagree here a little bit with Susan, is that over the years, states have developed certain templates to address digital trade. So we have a positioning of the stakeholders. And I think the United States maybe not now proactively involved in this sort of further development of the templates, but there is still something there. And it all started really with the CPTPP, with this agreement that we have between 11 countries in the Pacific Rim, which was, however, very much influenced by the United States in the negotiations that led to this agreement. And what we see here is a very liberal approach towards digital trade, towards data flows, which is also somehow combined with the relatively low standards of privacy protection. So the CPTPP and later on also the updated NAFTA, the USMCA, they basically say that anything goes, and even voluntary schemes are sufficient to provide somehow interoperability between the different parties as part of those treaties. The reason I mentioned this CPTPP model, and for you to understand perhaps a little bit the landscape, is that this model has indeed diffused. So we see very clearly that a lot of other countries have replicated this particular approach towards digital trade, and including the free flow of data and a ban on data localization measures. So we do have a great number of agreements that follow this approach. And on top of that, however, as Susan mentioned, maybe not the best way to go forward, but we have seen some strands of legal innovation in the digital economy agreements, which have now become sort of the latest trend in this digital trade landscape, with the UK-Singapore digital economy agreement being the last one. And here, what is perhaps interesting to point out for the regulatory, for the trade experts, is that not all of them are necessarily linked to a trade agreement. So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Chile and New Zealand and Singapore is not. However, the rest are really part sort of as a trade deal. And this, of course, has implications for the enforceability of these different types of agreements. So we can see the EU approach as a reaction a little bit to this evolving regulatory landscape, and also a little bit as trying to safeguard its own values in this regulatory landscape. Here it is interesting to see the evolution of the EU position over time. So if you look at the entire sort of set of free trade agreements that the EU has, and there are quite a number of those, the early agreements are very cautious. So in a sense, the EU has been really a late mover into this sort of new dynamic of digital trade rulemaking. If you look at agreements with Chile, with South Korea and others, they don't have anything on digital trade, or very, very few soft law cooperation type of provisions. Even the agreement with Canada, the one from 2016, from 2017, has very little in it. I mean, there are certain soft rules to try to promote transparency, to protect privacy, but those are soft things, and there is really nothing on data flows. And this changed a little bit, or started to change, with the EU-Japan agreement and the updated of the EU-Mexico global agreement, where basically there was a placeholder for the parties to reassess the situation and agree on provisions on data flows later on. Now the EU, also as Susan pointed out, does have a template, and it's a relatively clear template that for the first time sort of replicates some of the US-like CPTPP-like provisions. You know, they say, well, we agree we're going to have a ban on data localization measures with certain exceptions. We're going to have also basically commit to the free flow of data, yet those must be coupled with the high standards of data protection coming basically from the EU General Data Protection Regulation, and endorsing privacy as a fundamental right. So this is also the treaty language you're going to see in the FTAs, basically saying privacy is a fundamental right. And you're going to see here the language which I have extracted from the currently negotiated trade deals that the EU has with Australia and Tunisia, and the recently adopted agreement with New Zealand. They say, well, privacy is a fundamental right. We would like to have very robust data protection at home. And this might also include some sort of a limitation to the cross-border transfer of data. On top of that, we have this really broad carve-out that the EU really likes in order to protect its policy space, where it says, well, you know, we can regulate in any situation if we wish to achieve a legitimate policy objective, including a great number of public policy objectives and privacy and data protection in particular. So we have this approach, which, as I mentioned before, is now confirmed in the agreement with New Zealand, as well as the post-Brexit trade and cooperation agreement with the United Kingdom. It is very clear that the EU is sort of exporting, in a sense, its rules, this sort of very robust data protection that it has at home through the GDPR. And this is doing this not only through the channel of free trade agreements, but also through other channels as well. This includes, on the one hand, a sort of an extraterritorial effect of the GDPR itself, as you know, basically targeting also companies, actors that are not necessarily headquartered in the EU, but might in some way process EU citizens' data. And another way of sort of exerting this Brussels effect, as it's called, is through the adequacy decision, which the EU adopts with individual states around the world, which have to provide an equivalent level of data protection in their own territories. And we have this agreement with the UK, Japan, and others. And the EU is really pushing for more of those adequacy decisions. Now, very recently, starting maybe this year, the EU has really tried to go on this sovereignty building channel, I would say, in the data-driven economy. And they define it very broadly. They talk not only about digital sovereignty, they talk about data sovereignty and technological sovereignty, which all of those, of course, coupled with the very robust regulation of the digital economy that the EU adopts at home, basically the standards and benchmarks through the Digital Services Act and others that basically also have a sort of an extraterritorial effect, this wish to protect, EU citizens' rights and capture also these big tech companies, which are not necessarily, of course, EU-based. Maybe just as a side note, it's interesting to see the UK, because this is an Oxford-based seminar, to basically mention that the UK might be moving away a little bit from this model, and it's doing this now in recent times quite proactively. So there might be some tension with the EU going forward. If one looks, of course, at the terms that we have coming from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the adequacy decision, which might not be satisfied if the UK is really pushing through this sort of more liberal approach, very much in the model of the CPTPP and the USMCA, basically the US model. So we have this really contrast between the EU and the United States and all the other countries where the model has diffused, of course. And I haven't listed here China or India, but the EU is in a way similar to China because it has a conditional approach to data flows, but of course very different in the justification that it gives to this conditional approach to data flows. And some of this justification for the EU approach simply comes from its very culturally embedded and legally embedded perception of how privacy should be protected. So it's not somehow, it's a relatively, it's a translation of what the EU is doing at home and its international framework. Maybe just to address very briefly some of the questions that Chris has posed to us in the very beginning of this webinar. What's to expect next? What we will be seeing next? I think, I mean, being a pragmatic observer, that the most likely scenario is sort of preserving the status quo, and we're going to see an increased contestation between these different models that we have, US plus the EU with the Brussels effect and China and other countries, without finding really a common solution on the WTO forum or elsewhere. And really this topic of data sovereignty, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, I must say, will become more important, and countries are going to do more and more things to protect this data, digital/technological sovereignty. There have been some suggestions, of course, in the literature and policy that this is not the way forward. This is not the right way where, you know, we should really regulate the data-driven economy. And there have been some suggestions to move towards a global privacy enforcement treaty, a suggestion that has been endorsed by Anupam Chanda and Paul Schwartz. They basically suggest two things: one that goes on more the procedural side of things, with strengthening the accountability mechanisms in the sense of basically making a global privacy shield type of agreement. And the other one, which is, I think, rather unlikely, is to agree substantively on what the rules on personal data protection should be and move towards a global agreement on privacy. I'll stop here. I couldn't see the time and couldn't follow the time, but I'll be very happy later on to engage in the discussions and address some questions. Thank you so much.
So much, Mira. That was really excellent, and an excellent overview of what's happening in the EU, and also all these trade agreements that are emerging in different parts. Okay, over to Professor Yikchan Shin now, who's going to talk about the Chinese perspective.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself first. So can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. So actually my presentation is following the Chris's 5 questions. So it's actually trying to attempt to answer the questions posed by Chris. So the first one is about the features of China's the rules on global on governing the transporter flows. So basically, the governance of the cross-border flow in China is closely tied to the 3 elements. One is sovereignty. One is, as my previous speaker already mentioned, so it's about national sovereignty and also national security and the personal data protection. So those 3 elements, which actually shaped China's governance of the cross-border flow. And then, on the other hand, they also categorized the data and according to different purpose and different natures. So there are 7 categories of cross-border data flow and also different local storage requirement. So I will touch this later on. So in terms of the FTAs, China has already Australia FTA, but it's also joined the RCEP, and they are applying for the CPTPP and the DPA. Sorry. So what are the differences of the difference and the divergence you can see between the three countries? I mean, EU, China, and India. So, so before I go to the difference, I would like to point out why there are differences. Because basically, it reflects the commercial interest and the regulatory approach between those different three regions or countries. So for the US, they are more the interest, that commercial interest is to protect the digital service oriented firm. And also because if you look at the US regulatory model, is more about a permissive legal framework, which means they minimize states' intervention in government regulate the market. And if you look at China, China is actually a major e-commerce form trading physical goods. So therefore, they focus on traditional goods rather than the e-commerce. Rather than the data. And so therefore, they have a different interests. And also, China's regulatory approach is subject to having the state legal regulation, also co- and self-regulations, so which is different from the US. And where the EU, as they are more emphasized on the traditional of the human rights protection, and also there are no major digital platforms, dominating in the global e-commerce market. And on top of that, there are lack of the strong central governments to override security issues, because without the EU, there's no central governments, to concern the whole security issues. So those three different reasons, that's why contribute to different approach. And so I will skip this part because that's all quickly. Because if you look at the American style in terms of the free trade systems, so they are more emphasized on individual and consumers' rights in digital products, and also have a very restrictive role for the governments to control over the flow of data. So the TPP is the first one imposed a binding provision in terms of how of the free flow of information, to make it a free flow of information as a binding norms. And the TPP actually was preserved in other FTAs like CPTPP and also US and Mexico-Canada agreements. But on the other hand, they also talk about the privacy, because if we look at the US submission to the WTO committee, and they mentioned about privacy, they say privacy is a matter that is least trade restrictive, allow trade to flourish, will preserve the legitimate public policy objective. They agree that we need to protect privacy, but they want to have a less trade restrictive effect. So if you look at the EU's approach, as Mira just mentioned, actually they use the adequacy decision, to restrict the free flow of the information outside of the EU. And also they she mentioned they have this right to take and maintain personal data protection measure as they deemed appropriate. So actually deemed appropriate is give a quite broad discretions, to the EU as a regulator to impose the regulation on the cross-border flows. And they have more strong language and data protection in the future regional agreements. So if given the intrusive rules in the GDPR, sorry. So if you look at the China's approach, actually it's interesting because actually, if you look at the details, regulatory provisions, there are very few cases in China where the export of the data is completely prohibited, and the majority of the data can be legally exported after meeting the requirements such as a security assessment, security certificate, or standard contract and the extras. And the latest data security assessment measure actually provide some legal certainty by defining 4 categories of personal and important data that are required to do the security assessment. So, and if you look at those security requirement, you found actually this is the formulation is quite a more detailed really reference to the provision of the national security exceptions in many FTAs. Because in many FTAs, they also have a national security exceptions. And if you look at the China's data export security assessment measures, they have a similarity between these two measures. And also, they also put like a legality, legitimacy, and necessity as a test, okay, in the restrictions, which actually in line with the personal information protection law. So here, look at the different FTA. We found when China joined the RCEP, and they agreed the default should be the free flow of data, not force the data localization, but they want to have a potential border exception provisions. So, and the DPP actually afford like a public interest and the security exceptions, okay, but they have to pass a very strict test, for example, purposive limitation and the necessity text. So, and I would like to say that China's cross-border rules will inevitably affect the direction of international cross-border rules. So therefore, engage with them is quite important. So if you look at the developing country like India, I think they have a different, not a different demand or needs. For example, they want to protect the right to development and maintain the industry autonomies, because unlike the US, China, you know, and they are more lack of the digital capacity, and also there's a digital divide. So therefore, and they also have a national security interest concerned. So therefore, for them, they're more concerned about the right to development and maintain industry autonomy. I think that's the differences between those regions and the countries. So how flexible is the idea to developing a common international approach to cross-border data flow? What do we think we need to happen to enable some convergence to in order to develop a common approach? So I think from my personal point of view, there's some challenge of the global standard setting. So many people propose a solution, you know, there's a divergence. How can we reconcile or resolve this divergence? So there's a kind of like a compatibility mechanism. So there's a different compatibility mechanism. And one of the mechanisms is to establish regional interoperability mechanisms, such as the transatlantic data privacy framework or the CBPR. And but the main concern of this is that many of those mechanisms actually is still aligned with the composition of geopolitical power and also with the existing trade bloc. So they're not able to solve the fundamental problem of establishing an international regulatory framework. So that's a problem. Even they have this interoperability mechanism, but still they're still aligned with the geopolitical power and the trade blocs. And the other issue is also the national security issues. I think many people already touched it, you know, and the national security issues become a very dominant narratives in both the domestic law and also in the FTAs, not only by China, but also by US and the EU. So then the next question is, what is is there any possibility to establish international standard? So there's a role of the WTO in defining international rules in data flows. So as I said, you know, but it's very difficult to because the negotiation in the WTO is very slow. So the first of all, for establishing international regulatory or cross-border flow, we need to resolve the problem of consensus. So it's not really about data localization or national security, because this is still subject to the sovereign state's policy choice. But fundamentally, it's more about to solve the problem of consensus. That is, what model, what scope, and what path of cross-border data flow can be generally agreed by different countries, and how to find a dedicated balance among the cross-border data and also the legitimate public goals of various states, and also individual digital rights, as Susan just mentioned, you know, and in a contextualized, inclusive, and proportional and tier-made manner. So this is a problem if we want to establish international rules in data flow. So WTO has a kind of role to play. You know, even the progress is very slow. Recently recent progress is the negotiation under the joint statement initiative on the e-commerce, so which is backed by 76 WTO members. So and the 86 WTO members already joined the development, participate in this negotiation. So they want to seek the expeditious progress in negotiation, including on the key issue of data flow and the data localization. And on top of that, they also have this kind of e-commerce capacity building framework, which help the developing country and less developed country to build up their capacity. So whether they can achieve a thin agreement we still have to wait to see, but we can see is a progress at the WTO. So what institution arrangement do I think would need to create to monitor and implement such a common approach? So I think first of all, it's about the national security and the public policy exceptions. If you look at all these FTAs, even WTO negotiation, there's a narratives of national security exceptions. So therefore, we can see that the tendency countries increasingly adopt a very broad understanding of national security, which is beyond the traditional definition, such as a military threat or and to include such as the non-traditional concerns, such as poverty, trade, economy, human rights, and environmental security. So this is what we call the secularization of the industry policy. So therefore, first of all, in order to build up a consensus, that's a lead to drawing a rational distinction between the legitimate security measure from the other legitimate non-security measure. So this is the first thing we need to address. And the second is, so how can we address that? So first of all, we need to understand how the change of the understanding of the trade and the security at the national level, which crash with the global economic governance, because at a different national level, they have a different perception about the relationship between trade and security. In China, in EU and the US, they all have a national security concern. So how this different understanding between the trade and security crash with the global economic governance? I think that's the one problem we need to look at. And the second is a relationship between the notion of cybersecurity, data governance, and the international trade law, and needs to be clarified. And thirdly is whether we need innovation, in conceptualize the national and also international operation of the security. And thirdly, we need some institutional mechanism to reconcile, the security issue with the trade obligations. So this is institutional mechanism can be a trade rules, judicial reviews, cyber democracy, or the international regulatory cooperation, or even the WTO as a venue. So if you look at WTO mechanism, because this is I'm focusing on. So at the moment, WTO, they still need a binding mechanism to enforce the rules and resolve the dispute. And but there's an issue about WTO's dispute panels, because the US has blocked, the hire of the new judge of the WTO's dispute panels. So this is one of the obstacles. The second obstacle is also about whether there's a consensus the WTO needs to reform, and to provide a lesser condition to to facilitate the three largest economies like China, EU, and the US to address the trade tensions. Because without the cooperation between the China and the US, it's very difficult to reach any trade agreements under the WTO mechanisms. So there's a urge of the reforming of WTO. So what are the risks of not developing a common international approach? And so there's several risks. First of all, of course, is increase the transaction costs and the risk for the business sectors, because without the common framework, if just between the bilateral agreements or regional agreements, or even the country between country to country, between company to company, which will increase the transitional cost and the risk for the business sectors. And secondly, the FTA is not to set up the international ground common framework, but mainly is strengthen the interdependence and the trust of country involved in that regional trade bloc. So we can see there's a divisions, country participate in the particular FTA, they will strengthen their interdependence trust, but excluded others. So this will produce the kind of exclusion effect and also digital divide fragmentations, and especially for a large number of the developing countries that are not integrated into the global trade system. And lastly is the perpetuate the geopolitical and the technological Cold War, because we can see a lot of the problem we are facing is the result of the geopolitical and the technological decoupling or Cold War. And if we cannot resolve the global governance of the data flow, it will probably could perpetuate, this kind of Cold War or the divisions or the we kind of decoupling. Yeah, I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yik, for that presentation. That was excellent. Our final speaker now is Dr. Mansi Kedia from India, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Decker. Just a moment, I'll quickly share my screen. I hope this is visible.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking you and Dr. Chin and Oxford Global Society for inviting me to this really wonderful panel discussion. I've gained a lot from listening to everyone that spoke before me, and also providing me a perspective that I think that I knew, but I'm seeing some really new ideas. And a lot of what I was going to say has already been said. So I'll skip over those and try to really focus on where we are in India and how India is not unique, I'd say, but still navigating on what it wants to do with cross-border data governance. I don't think that they have a position, and they have, but they seem to still be figuring out to what extent and how to sort of navigate it. So I'm going to cover India's current position on cross-border flow of data and how we got here. Some evidence on what the economic costs of data localization are and how different industries have been impacted by that, and how that may or may not influence the government's decision on policies and regulations, and some discussion on the way forward. Very quickly, just to set context, where are we, in terms of what does data flows really mean for India? And a lot of studies, and here I highlight one, where the Hinrich Foundation estimated that digital trade, including cross-border data flows and several other types of digital trade, several other components of digital trade, contributed really $35 billion in 2019 and to become $512 billion by 2030. What this is accompanied by is data on how traffic or internet traffic in India is largely driven by firms that are based in the United States, and that most of the data that is generated by internet use in India is actually stored outside India. The other important fact, I think, is that queries related to cybercrime and data requests raised by law enforcement agencies in India, 845 of them in 2021 were still pending under what we call the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, the international framework that is available for coordination and resolution of cybercrime, as well as some independent queries raised with foreign courts. What this has led to, that of the 62 countries that have a total of 144 data localization regulations, this is a number I've picked up from another report, and I'm going to admit that I haven't verified this, but let's say about these numbers, 62 countries, 144 data localization regulations as of 2021. India had the second highest number of restrictions behind China. which Professor Yin just spoke about, how despite these exceptions, China seems to be fairly firm on how it wants to allow export of data and free flow. And in India, the sectors that see data localization regulations are largely related to telecom subscriber data, financial services quite extensively, on cloud services that are provided to the government, company accounts, and other forms of public data that are collected by the government. Just to reiterate the strong position that India has on digital sovereignty and wanting some control over the data and over just the digital economy that is currently evolving in India. In multilateral agreements, and everyone's covered this, but just to sort of confirm India's position, we didn't sign the Osaka Tract, Japan's proposal on data free flow with trust in 2019, along with South Africa and Indonesia. We were the only country that didn't sign, and there were other countries, other developing countries such as Brazil, South Africa, China, that did go along with the G20 to cooperate on arriving at a global framework for data free flow. But India abstained from it. And similarly, on the WTO's joint initiative that Dr. Chin spoke about so eloquently, India, is opposing and finding ways to stay away from that discussion on different grounds. On the bilateral agreements, however, there seems to be a slight loosening of that stance, and there is at least some discussion on wanting to cooperate and wanting to allow free flow of data. However, there isn't a very firm documentation or firm wording in any existing agreement that would put binding restrictions on Indian companies to allow free flow of data. So on the US, we don't really have anything. It's sort of a stalemate. There is some discussion going on in the Trade Policy Forum, but we don't know what direction it's going to take. There is very loose language in the recently concluded India-UAE CEPA. In the Australia-India agreement, we do not have those negotiations recorded on cross-border data flows yet, but likely to happen. So what I'm trying to say is that while in multilateral agreements, India has had a much stronger position in terms of not wanting to engage or abstaining from any position that would even suggest that they'd allow for free flow of data. In bilateral agreements, there's a softening of that position. And domestically, what is happening is that India currently, on privacy issues related to data localization, India does not have a privacy bill. For the last 5 years, we've been trying to negotiate and work on something, a version of what we saw in 2021 that was very much aligned to the GDPR with the inclusion of several localization requirements, has been junked. And the telecom minister has said that a new version will be brought for consultation, and we are expecting that it will continue to include a combination of mirroring and hard localization requirements. There are also a ton of sectoral policies, and you saw that in the previous slide that we have probably the second highest number of localization restrictions, and it began with the Reserve Bank of India in 2018. It began much earlier when telecom companies were required to store data on subscribers and several other mandated security transactions to hold data. But in 2018, Reserve Bank started this whole process of bringing in financial services data transactions into domestic jurisdiction. So all of these sort of establish that India is not wanting to yet give up on holding a very strong position on digital sovereignty and having more control over the data. Now, what are some of the reasons that are driving this? So there are economic arguments, like some of the speakers have already mentioned, and then there are security arguments. And the economic arguments go along the lines of fighting digital colonialism. India wants to this is an opportunity for India to sort of recreate its own digital economy, which it has been trying to do, to fight the monopolization and dominance of big tech firms, US, Chinese firms, and they fear that allowing for free flow of data would slip away some of those negotiating powers and opportunities that they have for domestic companies. So that's one. Remains to be tested, but that's a space that they want to keep open. And the other is a very strong feeling that data localization will help drive the growth of the domestic economy in terms of helping build the data center industry, more infrastructure, more jobs, more innovation, and that this would create that inorganic push for the digital economy to grow. So protectionist measure in some sense. So these are the two economic arguments that are flowing in favor of data localization, and the security arguments, given that we have a tense neighborhood very much like South Korea, and I'll come to that difference between Korea and India in a little while, but and therefore it makes it important for India to also consider informational security, especially when, as already discussed, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty and other forms of international cooperation opportunities are broken. So securing access to data for law enforcement agencies become extremely important, and that is one reason for them to mandate data localization. Also, the manner in which cybercrime and cyber attacks are being implemented, a lot of cloud-based activities where the service providers or the hackers are not based on Indian soil, and therefore tracing them and getting to them also becomes a big challenge. So both economic arguments and security arguments become the driving force for India's current position. But having said this, at the same time, there is a recognition that a lot of this, that despite this, a lot of the economic growth, as well as international cooperation and reciprocity, would depend on India allowing data-free flows. And therefore, some softening or reconsiderations are at least emerging, if not making strong footholds yet. I'll talk a little bit about some research that we did and I was a part of, which established the economic implications. This is based on an econometric model where we try to look at how free flow of data really has an impact on digital trade. Without going into the technicalities, what we were able to model using a standard gravity model of trade was to find that a 10% increase in international internet bandwidth, which becomes a proxy for data flows, can lead to almost $7 billion increase in volume of goods trade in India. And what that does amount to is almost 12% of India's total volume of trade could increase with increase in internet bandwidth or data flow. So this is just an econometric exercise based on assumptions, but at least it tries to make the point which we went to the government with, that even if you want to localize, we must know what we are losing. What are the costs of localizing is something that one must recognize. And here is one number for you to consider. A few you can in the ballpark, and given errors of given margin of errors, we note that any localization measure will have implications on international trade, which is a great engine for the growth of the Indian economy. And then we sort of deep dived into specific companies and specific sectors, trying to understand what are the opportunity costs of data localization. And this largely emerged from India's very rapidly becoming policy of sectoral policies towards data localization. So we try to cut our sample across companies in different sectors, across companies that used their own servers versus used cloud-based servers for data processing and data storage. And we also covered them by size. So small companies versus big companies. And we found that there is a continuum. It's not as if all companies are equally affected. And so if you're saying that everybody's going to be badly affected and the economy will have a shutdown, but what we found was it's not true. The small enterprises were really like in we don't care sort of zone. And it was the really big companies, and also those big companies that were of the multinational nature or belonging to the financial services, media, and communication sector that were largely affected. And that was where the conversation was mostly happening. And again, evidence in terms of suggesting that if you're going to go this way, at least recognize that your policies may have a disproportionate effect on certain industries. So be cognizant of the fact that, while you feel that data localization is only going to be good in terms of pushing inorganic growth in some sense, there is also a huge cost that is coming to certain sectors, and whether you can afford that cost on those sectors of the economy or not. So that was the purpose of this exercise. Also, what you can see is that not all of them were really engaging in cross-border flow of data. So there were some that were, and where the costs were very high. But then there were also some companies that were engaging in cross-border data flows, which said that, no, we can very quickly move to a localized regime. So even if we are currently sending data abroad or processing or storing data abroad, it's not going to be super difficult for us to do it in India. So in that context, also, there was a difference. So after having done all of this, and it's really nice that everyone else has spoken before me, is when I was putting together slides and thinking of a way forward, I essentially thought that probably India is going to have something like a fourth model, and that it won't be all US, and it's not going to be all EU, and it's not going to be China and Russia. And we did think about, and the main problem is just contesting these value systems, right? Where the US is basically driven by allowing free flow for its private companies, which are the owners of data. And then you have EU, which sits, as Professor Burri said, is sitting and fundamentally based on protection of citizens' rights, and everything sort of emanates from that. All the adequacy emanates from the fact that there's privacy should be protected. And then you have China and Russia, where lens is more on informational security. Where is India? We feel like India is like a little bit of everything. They want. We don't even have a privacy bill, but privacy does, at least in all the discussions we've been having and listening to, privacy is important. Informational security, national security, extremely important. And the business and the industrial side is equally important. So I think we're going to see a model which is going to be a mix of these three. And one of the proposals that India made was looking at a data-oriented jurisdiction. And this was a proposal they made to the ad hoc committee that is working on international cybercrime, where they said that they wanted a broader jurisdiction over citizen data. So it didn't matter where the data was stored or processed or screened, but if it was data belonging to Indian citizens, then they should have, then the ownership rights would rest with the country. So, but we don't yet know whether this is going to see any traction, but that's India's proposal for the moment. The other important thing I feel that is going to shape India's conversations is on the role of the private sector. And we've seen it demonstrated in both Korea and Singapore in terms of how they're at least enabling domestic data sharing. And that has also translated into how they are approaching their foreign negotiations. So despite similar sort of national security concerns in South Korea, they are much more open to data free flow with trust. For example, they're a part of the Osaka track, but India abstained from it. Versus India is still very domestically and government oriented, so that the India's data empowerment and protection architecture, for instance, largely focuses around what the government can do and government engagements, and not so much on how we can engage the private sector into this model. The final point is while everyone was talking about, how do we get to an international agreement, in my mind, I think we have to accept that, it's going to be the world of the second best, and that we probably may never land up with an agreement which everyone would agree to. And what would be this world of the second best? And we already have some examples, and several examples have already been spoken about in the previous presentations. One is definitely to reform the MLAT. We already have a framework. It just needs to be strengthened. We need capacity building around it. We need institutions to coordinate and make it more effective. Regional blocks such as the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation on Privacy, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, again, something that both India and Korea have stayed away from for the moment, but an extremely effective framework to not localize and yet solve the access to data problem for law enforcement and cybercrime. So I think there is a solution somewhere in the middle, which may not emanate from a complete global agreement on all of these issues. And to me, that's not pessimistic, really. It just seems more pragmatic. So I'll stop here and look forward to any comments and feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kedia. That was really interesting to get the perspective on India and the frameworks that are emerging there. We've got 2 questions in the chat, which I'll put to you all, and then I'll put another question to you to try and close out discussion or stimulate the discussion. The first question is whether it's particularly directed to you, Dr. Kedia, but also to the other speakers, and it's about the free flow of data. And the question is the free flow of data and trust initiative. And the question specifically is why India didn't sign up to that. And the more general question is whether other speakers consider it to have potential and whether it can be improved as a potential model for the global free flow of data. So this is talking about the free flow of data and trust initiative. So that's the first question. The second question is whether, again, directed to all speakers, there are already examples of digital trade provisions that address cross-border cooperation on data spaces. And we may have touched on that in the discussion earlier, but it'd be good to highlight that. So perhaps if we go to you first, Dr. Kedia, to talk on the India perspective and then open it up.
Thank you for the question. Well, the reason India didn't sign is all the reasons that I spoke about in the presentation, is that they have a very strong position on wanting to protect the opportunity they have to create a homegrown digital economy that is not dominated by American or Chinese companies. And they feel that this is that allowing for data localization and not allowing for cross-border free flow of data, despite having really benefited a lot from that during the period of the IT revolution. I mean, that's how India really came to become an IT giant in some sense. But in terms of digital, we sort of missed that bus, and here is our opportunity. And so the economic lens is there. And the second is the national security lens, which also becomes important. And committing to anything at the G20 would mean that they have very little policy space to maneuver domestically. And I think, and that's the reason why it's not just the Osaka track or the G20, but in any other multilateral forum, they have abstained from taking a position on data free flow. In fact, and only probably trying to break ice through bilateral agreements, which they are more comfortable with, or choose specific partners with whom they feel that there is a big trade deal or there is an economic engagement that is worthwhile to reconsider their data governance policies around.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to offer an opinion on whether they think this initiative is...
I mean, I think Japan had the right idea, but never spelled it out. I actually have never heard of the Free Flow with Trust initiative. I understand what you're trying to say. I think all governments seek to build trust. As I said before, the problem is that basically they are trying to build trust among governments. I have
Susan, you are wrong. Yeah.
Sorry, someone just called me. But I do think, you know, that's inherently part of it. My view, as I've expressed in several scholarly articles, including one upcoming at Oxford International Review, the trust issue, I mean, is very difficult because you really need to survey users to understand what makes them feel unsafe or that they don't trust the digital environment. And I don't think any trade agreement includes sufficient provisions that address their concerns. And again, in my mind, those concerns include censorship, harassment, disinformation, cyber theft, cyber manipulation. So let's be real here. How do you address cyber manipulation, as example, in the metaverse? I don't see any evidence policymakers are even talking about that. There are efforts to do this related to disinformation. The New Zealand government has been trying to get some common ground on cross-border data flows related to disinformation. In the United States, it's a real problem because it's viewed as censorship. I'll let others speak.
Maybe just to add something, I mean, this is a wonderful initiative, data flows with trust, but it was never really filled with contents, what exactly this means. And it hasn't found an institutional home yet. I mean, there have been, of course, the initiatives that are linked to the joint statement initiative that was talked about. But I mean, it's again, each country fills this with very different content. I don't think India is going to be under a lot of pressure if they sign to an initiative like this, because it's entirely of a sort of declaratory, soft law nature. I mean, for me, it would be best for India maybe to join RCEP, because there are so many carve-outs, so many policy space, and it would be actually relatively easy in terms of digital trade policy, notwithstanding the other issues, of course, that are part of this trade agreement, to join. But let's see.
Yeah, I think I also agree with the Mira, and others. Actually, the trust is a buzzword, and also this G20, trust. I mean, not only in data, in AI, in any regulatory framework will talk about trust. So it doesn't have a very concrete measures as well. And I think most of the developing countries, including India, not only India and African country, and they do not join the ASEC, the Japanese initiative, not because of they do not want to have trust, but as Mansi just mentioned, is more about autonomy, industrial autonomy, national security concern, and all the other concerns. If we really want to talk about the trust, so the G20 agreement didn't address those concerns of the developing country and also other countries as well, not only India. So trust is not the core. I think that's my answer. Thank you.
Can I add something to this? Which is basically trust is impossible to measure, right? We do use proxies, but to me, proxies are extremely dangerous. For example, logically, I don't understand how broadband is any way, shape, or form a proxy for cross-border data flows. The only way to measure cross-border data flows, in my mind, like trust, is you could try to measure the corruption, the counterweights. So what are trust-building things? But when we rely on proxies, which is the dilemma here, because we're not directly able to measure the actual flow or to measure trust, and I'm not dissing your report, but I just think it's a dangerous place, right? So we really don't have the information we need to say this builds trust or this doesn't build trust, because again, it's not something that you can measure. But I do think the effort to try to do it is a good idea.
Thank you.
To try to build trust.
You have a question, response. Sorry, Mansi, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add that, on the G20, the not becoming a part of the data free flow with trust, like everyone said, I don't think it was a substance, but it was more about the signal that countries wanted to put in place about whether or not they were on the negotiating table. So everyone's absolutely right in terms of there not being enough substance on how that free flow would happen, but more in terms of a signal whether or not they were ready or they were willing or open to the idea of free flow of data. So I just wanted to sort of clarify that.
Thank you. So I'm just conscious of time. We've got another question, which was the question about examples of digital trade provisions that address cross-border cooperation. And I know, Mira, you did it with some, and also Yikchan, you identified various agreements. Is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
I think there's a transatlantic, framework, privacy framework. So this is and the other one is I just mentioned is the ASEC. In the Asia Pacific corporations, they have this privacy framework as well, which is regional, but American and just expanded to a global initiatives, and as a kind of corporations interoperability mechanisms. But the problem with that, as I said, this Asia. The Asia Pacific CPAR framework has been criticized, which is to facilitate particular countries' interests and also to exclude it, some other countries as well. So all these regional operational operational mechanism has kind of the because it's a regional trade block based, so it's always have a kind of exclusions, issues as well.
Okay, excellent. So just to close it, I've got a question for all the panelists, just very quickly of you. So I think going back to the sort of overarching question that we were focused on this session, I think we've all seen that there's some value in cross-border data sharing. I mean, Mansi's slide was very clear in the digital trade benefits to India by 2030. And also that there's opportunity costs of data localization and the potential digital divide. But we've also identified various barriers and blockages to getting cross-border cooperation on data sharing. We've also spoken about future risks of not taking account of changes in technology, and Suzanne's presentation was very good on that. So I think the view is that something needs to happen. And in the discussion, I think there were three potential models or trajectories were presented. One, which came out, I think, particularly in your presentation, Mira, was the idea of having the CPTPP chapter and the EU template evolving, perhaps in tension with each other. Another model was Yifshan's model of the WTO as a thin agreement. And then Mansi's discussion at the end spoke about the UN ad hoc committee on data-oriented jurisdiction within the International Cybercrime chapter. So my question to all of you then is, of those three models or trajectories that came out of the discussion, which do you think is more desirable? Which do you think is more likely? And is there any other option? So perhaps we could start, if anyone wants, well, I'll leave the floor open if anybody wants to go first. Otherwise, we'll go through, or Yik-Chan, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, so I personally prefer the WTO model because, as I said, WTO model is more beneficial to the developing country and the less developed countries because they have to, because each have a more equally participate, and also the new initiatives, although South Africa and India and rejected because as they already Mansi already gave the reason, because basically they do not have this, want to have an agreement on the policy restriction on the restriction. They do not have a policy on free flow. They want to allow the country, to have a restriction on data. So that's the reason they rejected it. But if there's a thin agreement, as I said, which can accommodate, different cultural and these, and also domestic public interest policy, public policy, and national security exceptions in a thin and the contextual context, which will be good for developing countries, less developed countries. So this is my preference, okay? But realistically, I think the progress will be very slow, and we will see in the short and middle term, we will see a kind of regional and parallel universal. The worst, I think, the worst is a parallel universal, which has the power struggling between the US and China and Russia, and in the end, it's kind of parallel, a trade system. So that is the worst case. But in the middle, probably is the regional agreements with some interoperational, mechanism. So yeah, that's my perceptions.
Thank you. Anybody else? Does anybody else want to offer a view on which?
Yeah, sure. I think the models that you outlined, they're not necessarily in contestation, and they're going to happen all in a sense. I think we are going to continue with this very fragmented framework, and it's going to become even denser, I think, in a sense, more fragmented, but also denser, where countries realize that there is definitely a sort of a need, an enhanced need for international cooperation in this new data-driven economy. And we see this a little bit in our initiatives on interoperability of open government data, on digital identities, on AI frameworks. So that is moving a little bit, very slowly, of course. And then we're going to have perhaps a very thin agreement coming from the World Trade Organization, which still is going to be beneficial, for enabling digital trade, not necessarily solving all those sort of data issues, but still giving some legal certainty and opportunities for businesses, including in developing countries, as it was mentioned. So I think it's just going to be a lot of work for us as lawyers and political scientists. There's going to be a lot of research to do.
Thank you. Mansi, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I sort of completely agree with what Mira is saying. I think these are going to evolve parallelly. And I feel like it's probably a better way for it to evolve. It's going to be more organic, where countries choose to, they pick and choose what models. But I think what it will also do, as it eventually does in the case of several other global governance issues, whether it is climate or cybersecurity or trade, as it has been historically, there's always some sort of convergence that emerges. And, there eventually will be an organically determined governance model that more or less all countries would be comfortable with, some version of it. And that there could be an exception in one or two countries which are opposed to that idea. But I think we should allow for different models to evolve and for countries to choose from those models, instead of trying to force or drive or for policymakers or for anyone to actually say that, no, this is the best model. I don't think that is the best model. I think the model that works for a country is the best model. So I would completely agree with the others that we should let everything evolve parallelly and wait for things to unfold.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne, did you want to make a comment on this?
Well, I think data flows, data is exchanged. There's often no transaction involved. So is it really the right place to govern it under trade? That's where the action has been. I would hate to abandon it, but I think there are legitimate questions. But I think because we rely on the exceptions instead of coming up with clear rules, which I know is understandable, that result means that nations decide for themselves as opposed to, await a trade dispute, which is very rare, when they do things that could appear to violate market access or, other norms of the WTO. So should we start afresh by creating, as my colleagues at CG say, a data stability board? I don't know the right answer to all that, but I feel like the WTO is incapable of dealing with these issues multilaterally, and that's why, it would be good to see something building on, for example, DIPA, which I think takes a more flexible approach, but honestly, I don't know, and I'll leave it to all these brilliant people to make a better choice.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, well that's very useful, I think, to close out the discussion and to hear the view that no particular model is we should advocate for, and in a sense let them develop as they do and sort it out. I mean, I suppose the issue there is one of time. If we're talking years or decades, and the potential opportunity cost of that period, but nevertheless, it's probably better than imposing a model that nobody signs up to. Thank you very much, Aaron, for your taking the time today. I found that really interesting. It's been very useful, and I think fantastic to get these different perspectives from everyone around the world on what's happening in their countries, and also how they think a governance framework can evolve. So thank you again for your time, and I hope to see you again. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.